Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So I'm from University of Wisconsin, and I study education. My background is more cognitive psychology, and I study how people think and learn. And I also study what I would now say is the new third place, which is starting more and more to look like this, right? How many World of Warcraft players? Oh, like everyone. So Dimitri, put your hand up. There's Dimitri. Dimitri and I have been writing a paper. I really did send you the revisions email. About people in these spaces building social networks and how this lines up to forms of social capital that move through these social networks and spaces that are massively multiplayer online games. But my work actually focuses on something a little bit different. It turns out that's not all people are developing in these spaces. And so the last couple of years I've been doing ethnographic work and different analyses looking at the kind of intellectual practices in these spaces. You know, my background back in the day was building online learning environments. And then I went and took a look at what was typical play game spaces, and it turns out it was like 10 years ahead of time. So I switched to looking at what are people actually doing in these. And a lot of that looks at things like, you know, group hunts and the characteristics of them that line up to things that we know that are really popular in business right now. Or things like looking at how kids develop what some call an embodied empathy for a complex system. My night elf, although most people are sick of night elves now. And in doing so, end up exhibiting things like scientific habits of mind. These are standards from AAAS. And also literacy practices. A real interest of mine is media literacy. And so a topic near and dear to my heart is looking at things like, this is from Lineage 1 back in the day, about how literacy practices move through these spaces and are done around them and what kinds of practices kids are engaged in. And I do this in a context of education where people are horrified and scared that kids don't read and write anymore, which is probably the dumbest statement I'll make all day, which again is saying something. If you compare what they're doing, right, these literacy practices to things like our national reading standards and stuff like that, it turns out that these kids are doing stuff, and adults, but I'm interested in the kids, that not only meet these sort of standards, but actually in some cases wildly exceed them. Now, in my work, I really frame MMOGs as sort of like a gateway drug, right? And so far, I've gotten away with this, sort of saying, look, I'm interested in how these play spaces might sort of transition kids, young adults, into practices that have real leverage outside of them, inside of them, whatever. Now, of course, you start off and there's a real irony here, right? Because school, for those of us who are interested in education, school is supposed to train people in stuff that transfers to the real world. So now we're in this dilemma where we're having to make arguments like looking at what kids do in the game and in the real world, or what I would consider a real world, and talking about how it transfers to school when it was never supposed to do that in the first place. So there's an irony here about this, but I've gotten away with the gateway drug metaphor so far. But it does raise some really tough issues, and I'm only going to touch on 3 because these are the ones that I'm thinking through right now and I don't have a good solution to. And the first one is this real issue of access, and I don't mean just access to technology. That's grand, but come on, it's getting cheaper. Go buy a Dell. Yeah, that's okay to say. Sorry. I mean, you know, it's getting, it's getting, the access point is getting easier and easier in terms of technology. But when you start looking at the social networks of, say, for example, who's modding, that's the community I study right now, and it turns in they're very, very high end, and getting access to those practices in that social network is absolutely crucial, and it's hard to do from the outside. So that's issue 1. The other one is colonization. You know, we did this with anime. We did in literacy courses. We saw kids, especially kids that were in that last third of the classroom sort of, you know, curve, that weren't doing well in school, that were disengaged and basically failing. For that last third, a lot of these technologies and these activities really get them back engaged in what we would call valued practices. But there's a real thing about colonization, because what happened with anime and fan fiction was that we put it into classrooms, and guess what? for some of the kids, it turns out that it's really empowering. For other ones, it feels like you're getting colonized. And that leads to my third issue. Yes, Striper is up. And that's what I'm going to call the Christian rock problem. And by this I mean that part of the real dilemma here is that when you're looking at these sort of intellectual practices and talking about how grandiose they are and comparing them to standards and saying we basically kick your ass compared to classrooms, well, when you talk about putting them in settings beyond play, you have a real problem because part of the nature of gameplay was all about being slightly transgressive, it not having major consequence for things like your assessments in the real world, whether or not you graduate, whether or not you go to college. So you have this real problem where the moment you start tying like real-world consequence and things like we're going to make a game now that teaches you science up front, you end up with a Christian rock problem, meaning that you lose the element of transgression and something sort of slides there. So I'll end there. Did I make it?
You did.
Thank you.